They cornered her in the pilot's lounge after everyone else had left. Jake Morrison, the golden boy with perfect flight scores and an even more perfect smile, stepped closer with that swagger only trust fund kids seemed to master. His buddies flanked him like a pack of wolves circling prey. "Come on, Sarah," he said, his voice dripping with false charm. "Everyone knows you're just the tech girl who fixes our toys. Why don't you show us what else those hands can do?" The others laughed, but their laughter died when she stood up from her corner table. Not because she looked threatening. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." Sarah Chen was barely 5'4", quiet as morning mist. The kind of person who disappeared into backgrounds and lived in shadows. But when she rose, something shifted in the air around her. Something that made Jake's confident grin falter for just a heartbeat. "Back off," she said quietly. 3 simple words that somehow carried the weight of mountains. That's when Tyler Brooks pulled out his phone and started recording. "This is going to be epic," he whispered. But what happened next wasn't epic. It was legendary. Because the maintenance door at the back of the lounge suddenly opened, and a voice like rolling thunder filled the room. A voice that spoke 2 words that changed everything. "Deadshot." The phone clattered to the floor. Jake's face went white as desert sand. Because Captain Robert Martinez, the man who'd trained Navy pilots for 2 decades, wasn't looking at the troublemakers. He was looking at Sarah with something that looked dangerously close to reverence. The Arizona sun painted Phoenix Valley Aviation Academy in shades of copper and gold as the afternoon heat waves danced off the tarmac like invisible spirits. The smell of jet fuel mixed with desert sage created that distinctive cocktail of ambition and possibility that hung over every serious flight training facility. Somewhere between the distant mountains and the endless sky, dreams either took flight or crashed into the unforgiving reality of aviation's demanding standards. Hangar 7 buzzed with the controlled chaos that defined pilot training during peak season. Young aviators with fresh logbooks and older career changers chased the same dream from different directions. The massive space echoed with the sounds of progress, engines being tested, instructors shouting over propeller noise, and the constant hum of ambition being measured against ability. The concrete floors, stained with decades of oil and determination, had witnessed more failures than successes, more broken dreams than realized ones. In the far corner of the adjacent simulator building, Sarah Chen worked with the kind of focused precision that comes from understanding that other people's lives depend on getting every detail exactly right. Her dark hair was pulled back in, a practical ponytail, and her blue maintenance coveralls bore the faded logo of Phoenix Valley's Technical Services Department. She moved between the complex flight simulator systems like a surgeon navigating vital organs, her small hands tracing circuits and connections, with an intimate knowledge that went far beyond technical manuals. Most of the pilot trainees streaming through the facility barely noticed her. She was background noise in their personal dramas of advancement and achievement. The quiet Asian woman who kept the expensive equipment running so they could rack up the hours they needed for their commercial licenses. When they thought of her at all, which wasn't often, they saw someone who'd probably learned electronics at community college and found steady work maintaining the toys that real aviators used to chase their dreams. Sarah preferred it that way. Invisibility was a skill she'd cultivated with the same dedication others applied to perfecting their landing patterns. She'd learned that being overlooked was often the safest way to exist, especially when your previous life had involved the kind of flying that left no paper trail and generated no stories anyone was allowed to tell. The morning maintenance routine was meditation for her. Check the hydraulic systems that controlled stick response. Calibrate the visual projection systems that painted realistic landscapes outside simulated cockpit windows. Test the motion platforms. That convinced trainee pilots they were actually banking through turns thousands of feet above the earth. Each component was a crucial link in a chain of training that would either prepare these students for the realities of aviation or fail them before they could endanger themselves and others in real aircraft. She was elbow-deep in a malfunctioning weather simulation system when the voices started carrying from the pilot's lounge next door. The building's thin walls weren't designed to contain the kind of conversation that naturally evolved when young men with big egos gathered in groups. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Competitive banter had a particular sound, especially when it involved aviation students comparing everything from flight hours to family connections to romantic conquests. I'm telling you, that approach was textbook perfect. Jake Morrison's voice rose above the others with the confidence of someone who'd never faced real consequences for being wrong. Martinez can say whatever he wants about my altitude control, but my landing was smoother than commercial standard. Tyler Brooks laughed with the kind of forced enthusiasm that marked him as Jake's perpetual wingman. Dude, you greased that runway like you'd been flying jets for 20 years, instead of 20 months. Sarah continued her work, but her attention was now divided between circuit diagnostics and the conversation bleeding through the walls. She'd learned long ago that listening to background chatter could provide valuable intelligence about the people around her. Understanding personalities and dynamics wasn't just useful. In her previous life, it had been survival. What I don't get, Alex Rivera's voice joined the chorus, is why they make us sit through all these simulator sessions with the tech support girl watching us like we're going to break her precious machines. I mean, these systems are built to be operated by pilots, not babied by some maintenance worker who probably doesn't even have a private license. The weather simulation system Sarah was repairing chose that moment to emit a sharp electronic squeal that echoed through the simulator building like a mechanical scream. She adjusted a connection with perhaps more force than necessary, and the sound died into sullen electronic silence. The repair was actually complete, but she found herself continuing to work, her movements more deliberate as the conversation next door took on an edge that made her shoulders tense. You know what I heard? Danny Walsh's voice carried the conspiratorial tone of someone sharing gossip they probably shouldn't repeat. My cousin works in the administration office, and he says Sarah Chen doesn't even have proper flight credentials on file. Like, she might have a basic private license from years ago, but nothing current. Nothing that would qualify her to even understand what we're doing in these simulators. Sarah's hands stilled on the circuit board she was supposedly adjusting. The conversation had crossed from general pilot arrogance into personal territory, and that made it harder to ignore. She'd spent 2 years building her carefully crafted identity as a competent but unremarkable technical worker. The background checks had been thorough, the documentation perfect, but there were always gaps that sharp eyes might notice if they looked hard enough. That explains why she always looks so lost when we're running complex scenarios. Jake's voice carried a note of satisfaction, as if he'd solved a puzzle that had been bothering him. She's just pushing buttons and hoping the machines don't break. Probably thinks a chandelle is some kind of light fixture. The laughter that followed had a cruel edge that Sarah recognized from a dozen different contexts in her past. It was the sound of people building themselves up by tearing someone else down, the audio signature of bullies finding their target. She'd heard it in military briefing rooms where new recruits got hazed, in corporate boardrooms where executives played politics with people's careers, and in high school hallways where teenagers learned the early lessons of power and vulnerability. Sarah finished her repairs and began packing her tools with movements that had become automatic through years of practice. The work was done, but she found herself moving more slowly than necessary, her attention still caught by the conversation. That seemed to be gaining momentum rather than winding down. There was something building in those voices that experience had taught her to recognize as dangerous. "You know what we should do?" Tyler's voice carried the excited tone of someone who just thought of what seemed like a brilliant idea. "Next time we're doing simulator training, we should ask her some technical questions about flight dynamics, just to see how much she actually knows about what she's maintaining." "That's genius," Alex laughed. "Put her on the spot in front of everyone. I bet she doesn't even know basic aerodynamics." Sarah shouldered her tool bag and walked toward the exit, but Jake Morrison's next words stopped her cold. "Better yet, why don't we invite her to the pilot's lounge after training today? Tell her we want to discuss some technical issues with the simulator systems. See how long it takes before she admits she's in over her head." The tool bag suddenly felt heavier in Sarah's hands. She stood in the doorway of the simulator building, looking out at the tarmac where real aircraft sat baking in the desert sun, their metal skins hot enough to burn unwary hands. Those planes represented freedom and purpose and the kind of life she'd left behind when her previous existence had been officially erased for national security reasons. "Come on, guys." Danny's voice carried a note of uncertainty that suggested he might be the only one among them with functional moral compass. "That seems kind of mean. She's just doing her job." "Her job is maintaining equipment for real pilots," Jake responded with the kind of dismissive authority that came from never having faced genuine adversity. "If she can't handle a few technical questions, maybe she should find work that doesn't require understanding aviation." Sarah stepped out into the afternoon heat and closed the door behind her with a soft click that somehow managed to sound final. The conversation continued in the lounge, but she was no longer listening. Instead, she was remembering other times when people had underestimated her, other situations where quiet competence had been mistaken for ignorance or weakness. The Phoenix Valley Aviation Academy sprawled across several hundred acres of desert, its runways oriented to take advantage of prevailing winds and its buildings designed to withstand the temperature extremes that defined Arizona living. Sarah walked between hangars and maintenance facilities with the unhurried pace of someone who belonged in this environment, even if most people didn't recognize her right to be there. She'd been working at the academy for 2 years, maintaining a careful balance between competence and invisibility. Her supervisor valued her work. The equipment ran better under her care than it had in years, and the steady paycheck allowed her to maintain the modest apartment and unremarkable lifestyle that defined her current existence. It wasn't the life she'd planned when she was younger, but it was safe and sustainable and allowed her to use skills that would otherwise go to waste. The afternoon stretched ahead with more routine maintenance tasks, administrative paperwork, and the kind of predictable responsibilities that had replaced the adrenaline-fueled uncertainty of her previous career. Sarah had learned to find satisfaction in smaller achievements, systems that ran smoothly, problems solved before they became crises, the quiet pride of work done well even when no one was watching. But as she walked toward Hangar 7 to check on a radar simulation system that had been acting temperamental, she couldn't shake the feeling that the conversation she'd overheard was going to lead somewhere she didn't want to go. Experience had taught her to trust those instincts, especially when they involved the kind of men who saw vulnerability as opportunity and authority as license to abuse. The sun continued its relentless assault on the desert landscape, and somewhere in the air-conditioned comfort of the pilot's lounge, 4 young men were planning what they thought would be harmless entertainment at the expense of someone they decided was fair game. They had no way of knowing that Sarah Chen was the kind of person who'd learned to be dangerous precisely because she looked harmless, or that their casual cruelty was about to collide with a past they couldn't imagine and consequences they weren't prepared to face. The stage was set for a lesson that none of them would ever forget, delivered by someone they'd never bothered to see clearly. And in a few hours, when the afternoon training session ended and the pilot's lounge became the arena for their planned humiliation, They would discover that assumptions could be deadly and that the quiet ones sometimes had the most interesting stories to tell. The evening briefing room felt different when Sarah walked in 20 minutes before the scheduled meeting time. She'd been asked to attend by Linda Foster, the head of flight operations, to discuss some technical upgrades to the simulator systems. It was routine enough, the kind of consultation that happened monthly when administrative staff needed technical input on equipment decisions. But something in Linda's voice during the phone call had carried an undertone that made Sarah's instincts prickle with unease. The room was larger than necessary for its usual purpose, designed to accommodate full training classes, but tonight hosting only a handful of people scattered across the theater-style seating. Sarah chose a seat in the back corner, a position that offered clear sight lines to all entrances and put her back against a solid wall. Old habits died hard, especially when those habits had once been the difference between completing missions and ending up in unmarked graves in countries that didn't officially exist on operational maps. Jake Morrison entered with his usual theatrical flair, his flight suit unzipped just enough to show the expensive watch his father had given him for completing his first solo flight. He scanned the room with the casual arrogance of someone who'd never learned the difference between confidence and entitlement, his gaze lingering on Sarah for a moment longer than necessary. Tyler Brooks followed half a step behind, mimicking Jake's swagger with the desperate precision of someone who'd built his entire personality around reflected glory. Alex Rivera slipped in quietly, his nervous energy evident in the way he fidgeted with his tablet and avoided making eye contact with anyone. Danny Walsh brought up the rear, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world. His reluctance was written across his face in lines of discomfort that suggested his conscience was having a vigorous argument with his desire to fit in with the group. Linda Foster entered with the brisk efficiency that had made her legendary among aviation professionals throughout the Southwest. 25 years of managing air traffic control towers had given her an almost supernatural ability to read people and situations, to spot problems before they developed into crises. She carried herself with the authority of someone who'd guided thousands of aircraft safely through complex airspace, making split-second decisions that affected hundreds of lives at a time. "Good evening, everyone," Linda's voice carried easily through the room without seeming raised. "Before we discuss the simulator upgrades, I wanted to address some concerns that have come to my attention regarding professional conduct and respect for all Academy personnel." Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. Professional conduct. Meetings were rarely called without specific incidents to address, and the timing felt too coincidental given the conversation she'd overheard earlier. She kept her expression neutral, but her attention sharpened to the kind of focused awareness that had once helped her survive situations where split-second reactions meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Jake shifted in his seat, his confident demeanor flickering slightly. "Ma'am, if this is about the simulator training sessions, I want to assure you that all student pilots have been following proper protocols for equipment use and maintenance requests." "I'm sure they have," Linda replied, but her tone suggested she was sure of nothing of the kind. "However, I've received reports that some personnel may be planning activities that could be construed as harassment or unprofessional behavior toward Academy staff members." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken tensions. Sarah watched the four young men carefully, noting the micro-expressions that most people would miss. Jake's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Tyler's eyes darted toward the exit, as if calculating escape routes. Alex seemed to shrink into his seat, while Danny looked genuinely confused, as if he was trying to figure out how their casual conversation had escalated into a formal meeting. "Ma'am," Tyler spoke up, his voice carrying a note of injured innocence that sounded rehearsed, "I think there might be some misunderstanding. We were just discussing ways to better understand the technical aspects of our training equipment. Professional development, you know." Linda's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes suggested she'd heard similar explanations before and hadn't been impressed then either. Professional development is encouraged and supported through appropriate channels. What concerns me are reports of plans to deliberately put staff members in uncomfortable situations under the guise of technical discussions. Sarah felt the conversation shifting around her like weather patterns changing before a storm. Whatever had triggered this meeting, it was clear that someone had been listening to more than just her accidental eavesdropping. The Academy had its own intelligence networks, informal but effective, and information had a way of traveling through maintenance crews and administrative staff faster than official communications. If anyone in this room is planning activities that could be considered harassment, intimidation, or unprofessional conduct, Linda continued, her voice taking on the kind of edge that air traffic controllers used when dealing with non-compliant aircraft, I strongly suggest you reconsider those plans. This academy maintains zero-tolerance policies for behavior that creates hostile work environments. Jake leaned forward slightly, his confident mask slipping back into place. With all due respect, ma'am, I think we're all professional enough to maintain appropriate workplace relationships. If there's been some misunderstanding about casual conversations, perhaps we could address specific concerns rather than making general accusations. The deflection was smooth, practiced, the kind of response that someone had learned from watching authority figures dance around uncomfortable topics without directly admitting fault. Sarah recognized the technique from briefings were operational. Failures were discussed in terms of learning opportunities and procedural improvements rather than acknowledging that people had died because someone had made catastrophic mistakes. Linda studied Jake for a long moment, her experienced eyes taking in details that most people would miss. Mr. Morrison, your flight training record shows excellent technical proficiency and above-average academic performance. Your instructor evaluations note confidence and quick decision-making under pressure. However, they also mention concerns about your interactions with support personnel and your tendency to treat authority as something that applies to other people. The observation landed like a precision strike, surgical in its accuracy and devastating in its implications. Jake's confident expression faltered for just a moment, long enough for everyone in the room to see the entitled teenager beneath the polished aviation student persona. Ma'am, I've always tried to maintain professional relationships with all Academy personnel, Jake replied, but his voice carried a defensive edge that undermined his words. If there have been specific complaints about my conduct, I'd appreciate the opportunity to address them directly. There haven't been formal complaints yet. Linda emphasized the word yet, with the kind of precision that suggested formal complaints were a distinct possibility if certain behaviors continued. But there have been observations, conversations, overheard, patterns of behavior noted by people who've been in this business long enough to recognize trouble before it fully develops. Sarah remained silent, but she was beginning to understand that this meeting wasn't random. Someone had been watching, listening, evaluating the dynamics between the pilot trainees and the Academy staff. The question was whether this intervention would be enough to diffuse the situation, or whether it would simply drive the problem underground, where it could develop without supervision. The reason I've called this meeting, Linda continued, is to ensure that everyone understands both the professional standards expected at this academy and the consequences of failing to meet those standards. Flight training is stressful enough without adding interpersonal conflicts that could compromise safety and learning. Tyler raised his hand slightly, the gesture nervous and uncertain. Ma'am, are there specific behaviors we should avoid? I mean, beyond the obvious professional courtesy expectations? It was a reasonable question, delivered with what seemed like genuine concern for following proper procedures. But Sarah caught the subtle way his eyes flicked toward Jake, seeking approval or instruction. The group dynamic was becoming clearer, Jake as the leader, Tyler as the willing follower, Alex as the uncertain participant, and Danny as the reluctant conscript who'd gotten pulled into something he didn't fully understand. Avoid any behavior that could make another person feel targeted, uncomfortable, or professionally undermined, Linda replied. Avoid creating situations where power dynamics could be misused, or where someone might feel pressured to participate in activities that aren't part of their job responsibilities. And definitely avoid any actions that could be interpreted as testing, challenging, or humiliating other Academy personnel. The words hung in the air like smoke from a warning flare, clear and unmistakable in their meaning. Sarah watched the four men process this information, seeing different reactions play across their faces. Jake's expression had hardened into the kind of stubborn resistance that suggested he viewed this as unfair interference with his natural authority. Tyler looked confused, as if he couldn't understand why casual workplace interactions were being treated as potential misconduct. Alex seemed relieved, as if the formal warning had given him permission to step back from whatever the group had been planning. Danny looked genuinely surprised, suggesting that he might have been unaware of how their casual conversation could be interpreted by others, or escalated into formal corrective action. "Are there questions about these expectations?" Linda asked, her tone making it clear that questions were welcome, but arguments were not. The silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. Sarah could almost see the internal calculations happening as each man weighed the risks and benefits of different responses. Finally, Jake cleared his throat and spoke with carefully controlled neutrality. "No, ma'am, the expectations are clear. Professional conduct with all Academy personnel, appropriate use of Academy facilities, and maintaining focus on flight training objectives." "Excellent," Linda replied, but her expression suggested she wasn't entirely convinced by Jake's sudden conversion to professional courtesy. "I'm glad we could have this conversation before any misunderstandings developed into more serious issues." As the meeting dissolved and people began filing out of the briefing room, Sarah noticed the subtle way the group dynamic had shifted. Jake and Tyler huddled together near the exit, their voices too low to overhear, but their body language suggesting intense discussion. Alex gathered his materials quickly and left without speaking to anyone, his relief evident in the speed of his departure. Danny lingered for a moment, glancing back toward Sarah with an expression that might have been apologetic. Sarah remained in her corner seat until the room was empty except for Linda, who was organizing papers with the methodical precision of someone who documented everything. When they were alone, Linda looked up and met Sarah's eyes directly. "Ms. Chen, I want you to know that the Academy takes workplace harassment seriously, regardless of who's involved or what their training status might be. If you experience any behavior that makes you uncomfortable or interferes with your ability to do your job, please report it immediately." Sarah nodded, appreciating both the offer of protection and the implication that Linda was aware of more than she'd revealed. During the meeting, "Thank you, ma'am. I appreciate the Academy's commitment to maintaining a professional environment." As Sarah left the briefing room and walked through the darkened corridors toward the parking area, she couldn't shake the feeling that the evening's intervention had been both helpful and potentially problematic. Official warnings sometimes solved problems by making people reconsider their actions, but they could also drive inappropriate behavior underground, where it became harder to monitor and more dangerous to address. The desert night air carried the scent of sage and distant rain, a reminder that even in the harshest environments, life found ways to adapt and survive. Sarah had learned that lesson in places far more dangerous than Arizona, and she understood that survival often meant being prepared for problems that others couldn't imagine. Whatever Jake Morrison and his friends had been planning, the evening's meeting had either ended it or forced it to evolve into something more subtle and potentially more dangerous. Sarah's instincts, sharpened by years of operations, were paranoia. Was professionalism and preparation was survival, suggested that the latter was more likely than the former. Part 3. Atmospheric Setup. The following morning arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that made the Arizona desert look like a postcard advertising the American Southwest. The sky stretched endlessly blue above the academy, broken only by the occasional contrail from commercial aircraft following their prescribed routes between major cities. The air was still cool enough to be pleasant, though everyone who worked at Phoenix Valley knew that within a few hours the temperature would climb into ranges that made any outdoor work a test of endurance. Sarah arrived at the academy earlier than usual, her morning routine adjusted by the restless sleep that had followed the previous evening's meeting. She'd learned long ago that when situations felt unstable, preparation was better than optimism. Her toolkit was more thoroughly organized than usual, her work schedule arranged to keep her in populated areas during peak activity hours, and her awareness calibrated to the heightened level that experience had taught her to maintain when potential threats were circulating in her environment. The simulator building felt different in the early morning light, its familiar spaces somehow more significant, now that they'd become the center of attention she'd spent 2 years trying to avoid. Sarah moved through her opening routine with mechanical precision, checking systems that didn't need checking, and organizing supplies that were already properly arranged. The busy work helped settle her mind while her subconscious processed the implications of the previous evening's developments. Hangar 7 was already active with the kind of controlled chaos that defines serious flight training operations. Instructors moved between aircraft with the purposeful efficiency of people who understood that aviation mistakes could be measured in lives rather than just dollars. Student pilots conducted pre-flight inspections with the careful attention to detail that would either become instinctive habits or get them killed in the unforgiving environment of real aviation. The morning air carried sounds that had become background music to Sarah's daily existence. Engines warming up, radio chatter from the control tower, the mechanical sounds of equipment being tested and prepared. Occasionally, the sharp crack of an aircraft breaking the sound barrier somewhere high overhead reminded everyone that they were operating in airspace that was shared with military installations and proving grounds, where much more serious flying was conducted. Sarah was calibrating pressure sensors on the flight management system when she first noticed the change in atmosphere that suggested her problems from the previous evening weren't going to disappear just because Linda Foster had delivered an official warning. Conversations stopped when she walked past groups of people who'd never paid attention to her before. Eyes followed her movements with the kind of curiosity that meant her name was being discussed in places where it had never come up previously. Jake Morrison appeared near the simulator building around mid-morning, ostensibly checking on a maintenance request that didn't exist. He leaned against the doorframe with calculated casualness, watching Sarah work with the kind of attention that was clearly intended to make her uncomfortable. His presence felt deliberate, territorial, like an animal marking boundaries that others were expected to respect. "Morning, Sarah," Jake said with a friendliness that sounded as artificial as flight simulator weather patterns. "How are those system upgrades coming along?" Sarah didn't look up from her work, but she was acutely aware of his position relative to the exits and the tools within her reach. "Systems are running within normal parameters. All maintenance schedules are current." "That's great to hear," Jake replied, his tone carrying undercurrents that had nothing to do with equipment maintenance. "I was talking to some of the other guys about how impressive it must be to understand all this complex technology. Really takes someone special to keep all these systems running smoothly." The compliment felt like bait, delivered with the kind of exaggerated sincerity that usually preceded requests for favors or attempts at manipulation. Sarah had heard similar approaches in briefing rooms where intelligence officers tried to develop assets among foreign personnel, building false relationships that could be exploited when the mission required certain kinds of cooperation. "Just doing my job," Sarah replied, her voice maintaining the neutral tone she'd perfected during her years of maintaining low-profile identities. "Is there something specific you need help with?" Jake pushed off from the doorframe and took a step closer to where Sarah was working, entering what most people would consider personal space, but stopping just short of behavior that could be clearly identified as inappropriate. "Actually, yes. Some of us were wondering if you might have time later to discuss some technical aspects of the flight management systems. Educational purposes, you know." Sarah finally looked up from her work, meeting Jake's eyes directly for the first time since he'd entered the building. What she saw there confirmed her suspicions about the previous evening's meeting. The official warning had been noted but not heeded. If anything, Jake seemed more determined than before, as if the intervention had transformed a casual plan into a personal challenge. "Technical discussions are usually handled through proper channels," Sarah replied. "Your instructors can arrange consultations with manufacturer representatives if you need detailed information about specific systems." "Right, of course," Jake agreed quickly, his smile never wavering. "But sometimes informal discussions can be more educational than formal presentations. Less structured, more opportunities for real questions and answers." Sarah returned her attention to the pressure sensors, but she was calculating distances and response times while appearing to focus on technical diagnostics. Jake's behavior pattern was becoming clearer. He was testing boundaries, seeing how far he could push before encountering resistance. The previous evening's warning had apparently been interpreted as a challenge rather than a deterrent. "I'll consider it," Sarah said finally, the response deliberately ambiguous enough to avoid immediate confrontation, while not committing to anything specific. "Right now I need to finish this calibration before the afternoon training sessions." Jake nodded with satisfaction, as if her non-committal response was actually an agreement to his vague proposal. "Excellent. I'll talk to the others, and we can arrange something informal. Maybe after regular hours when we won't be interrupted by scheduled activities." After he left, Sarah continued her work with hands that remained steady despite the adrenaline beginning to circulate through her system. She'd encountered similar situations before in contexts where the stakes were considerably higher than workplace harassment, and she understood that Jake Morrison was the kind of person who interpreted reasonable responses as weakness and professional courtesy as invitation for escalation. The afternoon brought increased activity as flight training schedules moved into high gear. Student pilots moved between ground school classes and practical exercises, their conversations filled with the pilot's the mixture of technical terminology and nervous excitement that characterized people learning skills that could kill them if performed incorrectly. Instructors monitored progress with the kind of focused attention that came from understanding that their responsibility extended far beyond teaching procedures to ensuring that only competent pilots were certified to endanger themselves and others in powered aircraft. Sarah noticed Tyler Brooks lingering near the simulator building during his break period, his presence obviously coordinated with Jake's earlier visit. He didn't approach directly, but his positioning suggested surveillance rather than coincidence. Alex Rivera appeared briefly near the maintenance storage area, glancing towards Sarah's workstation with the guilty curiosity of someone involved in planning something they knew was inappropriate. Danny Walsh seemed to be avoiding the area entirely, his absence more noticeable than the other's presence. Sarah interpreted this as either genuine discomfort with whatever was being planned or a more sophisticated approach to surveillance that relied on appearing uninvolved while actually monitoring from a distance. The pattern was becoming clear. Despite the previous evening's official warning, the group was proceeding with some version of their original plan. The formal intervention had forced them to be more subtle, but it hadn't changed their fundamental intentions. If anything, the official attention seemed to have elevated their casual meanness into something more organized and potentially more dangerous. Linda Foster appeared briefly during the afternoon, conducting what appeared to be routine administrative rounds, but clearly checking on the situation that had prompted the previous evening's meeting. She exchanged pleasantries with Sarah and made herself visible to the pilot trainees, her presence serving as a reminder that Academy management was paying attention to interpersonal dynamics. But Sarah understood that official protection had limits. Management could issue warnings and monitor behavior during business hours, but they couldn't control what happened in informal settings or prevent determined individuals from finding ways to circumvent supervision. Her experience in environments where official authority was often absent or compromised had taught her that personal safety ultimately depended on personal preparation. As the afternoon progressed toward evening and the regular training schedule began winding down, Sarah found herself facing a decision that felt familiar from previous lives, lived under different names in places that no longer existed on any maps she was allowed to discuss. She could continue trying to avoid confrontation, hoping that the situation would resolve itself through official channels and mature judgment, or she could prepare for the likelihood that some people only learned respect through direct experience with consequences they couldn't ignore or rationalize away. The desert sunset painted the Academy buildings in shades of gold and crimson, beautiful and harsh in the way that only extreme environments could achieve. Somewhere in that fading light, plans were being finalized by people who had never learned the difference between confidence and competence, between authority and respect, between testing someone's patience and discovering their true capabilities. Sarah finished her maintenance duties and prepared to leave for the day, but she made subtle adjustments to her departure routine that someone with the right kind of experience would recognize as tactical preparation. Her tools were arranged for quick access rather than just organization. Her route to the parking area was chosen for sightlines and escape options rather than just convenience. Her awareness was calibrated to threat levels that most civilian environments never required. Because Sarah Chen had learned in places far more dangerous than Arizona that the best way to avoid violence was to be thoroughly prepared for it, and that the most effective way to prevent escalation was to ensure that potential aggressors understood the full scope of what they were considering before they committed to actions they might not survive. Part 4. Protagonist Introduction, the Phoenix Valley Aviation Academy. Employee records showed that Sarah Chen had been hired 26 months earlier with impeccable references from a technical college in Colorado and previous employment at a small municipal airport in New Mexico. Her personnel file documented steady performance evaluations, perfect attendance, and the kind of reliable competence that made supervisors grateful rather than impressed. She lived in a modest apartment complex 15 minutes from the academy, drove a well-maintained but unremarkable sedan, and maintained the social profile of someone whose entire personality could be summarized as quiet and professional. What the records didn't show was that Sarah's real education had taken place in locations that didn't appear on civilian maps, under instructors whose names were classified at levels that most government employees never encountered. Her technical expertise hadn't been developed through textbook study but through hands-on experience with aircraft systems that pushed the boundaries of physics and engineering, in environments where equipment failure meant mission compromise, and mission compromise could mean international incidents that might never be reported in any public forum. The morning after her uncomfortable encounter with Jake Morrison, Sarah arrived at work with the subtle adjustments to routine that indicated someone whose threat assessment had moved from theoretical to practical. Her tool bag was organized differently, with certain items moved to positions that prioritized access speed over organizational logic. Her work clothes were chosen from the subset of her wardrobe that allowed maximum freedom of movement while maintaining her carefully cultivated appearance of technical competence and social invisibility. Sarah had spent her adult life mastering the art of being simultaneously capable and unremarkable, a combination that required constant attention to details that most people never considered. Her movements were economical but appeared casual. Her awareness comprehensive but seemingly unfocused. Her preparation thorough but invisible to observers, who weren't trained to recognize the difference between paranoia and professionalism. The simulator building felt different as she conducted her morning system checks, not because anything had physically changed, but because the previous day's events had altered the social dynamics that governed how she moved through the academy. Environment. People who had never noticed her before were now aware of her presence, creating the kind of attention that her training had taught her to avoid whenever possible. Sarah's real expertise went far beyond maintaining flight simulators. Though her civilian cover identity required her to demonstrate only the minimum competence necessary to justify her employment, she understood aircraft systems at a level that came from flying machines that civilian pilots never encountered, maintaining equipment under conditions that would terrify most technicians, and troubleshooting problems while under stress that made commercial aviation emergencies seem like routine inconveniences. Her hands moved across circuit boards and connection points with the muscle memory of someone who had performed similar work in situations where external lighting was limited to what night vision equipment could provide, where time constraints were measured in minutes rather than hours, and where the difference between perfect execution and close approximation could be measured in body counts rather than performance evaluations. The flight management system she was currently servicing was sophisticated by civilian standards, but primitive compared to the navigation equipment she'd worked with during her previous career. Still, Sarah approached the maintenance with the same methodical precision that had once been the difference between successful extraction and ending up as classified casualty statistics in operations that officially never happened. Her cover identity as a community college graduate with basic technical training required her to occasionally consult reference manuals and ask questions that someone with her actual background would never need to ask. The performance was carefully calibrated to demonstrate competence without revealing expertise, knowledge without suggesting experience that couldn't be explained through her official background. Sarah had been working on the weather radar simulation system when she first heard Jake Morrison's voice carrying from the adjacent briefing room, his tone carrying the kind of casual authority that suggested he was organizing something rather than just participating in conversation. The words weren't entirely clear through the building's walls, but the rhythm and inflection were familiar from contexts where young men with insufficient experience planned activities that exceeded their judgment and preparation. The thing is, Jake's voice rose slightly as he made what sounded like a persuasive argument. We need to understand these systems better if we're going to be professional pilots. And who better to explain them than the person who maintains them every day? Tyler's laugh carried a note of anticipation that made Sarah's instincts shift into higher alert status. Exactly. Educational opportunity. Professional development. No one could object to that. Sarah continued her work, but her attention was now divided between system diagnostics and threat assessment. The conversation next door had the feel of people convincing themselves that questionable actions were actually reasonable, the kind of rationalization that usually preceded behavior that participants would later claim had been misunderstood or taken out of context. Plus, Alex's voice joined the discussion with what sounded like reluctant participation. It's not like we're planning anything inappropriate. Just asking some technical questions to someone who should know the answers. The phrase, should know the answers, carried implications that Sarah recognized from previous encounters with people who enjoyed exposing others' perceived limitations. This wasn't about education or professional development. It was about creating a situation where someone could be made to feel inadequate or foolish in front of an audience that had already decided the outcome they wanted to see. Sarah's civilian identity required her to appear concerned, but not alarmed by workplace social dynamics, to demonstrate normal employee anxiety about potential harassment without revealing the kind of situational awareness that came from survival. training in environments where social predators were often more dangerous than enemy combatants. But beneath the carefully maintained surface of a quiet technician worried about workplace bullying, Sarah's actual assessment was proceeding along lines that her trainers would have recognized and approved. Jake Morrison was exhibiting the behavioral patterns of someone who had never faced serious consequences for his actions, who confused social privilege with personal capability, and who was likely to escalate rather than retreat when his authority was challenged. Tyler Brooks was demonstrating classic follower psychology: insufficient moral framework to resist group pressure, sufficient intelligence to understand the implications of planned actions, but inadequate courage to oppose activities he knew were wrong. Alex Rivera appeared conflicted, torn between group loyalty and personal conscience in ways that made him potentially unpredictable under pressure. Danny Walsh remained the wild card in the group dynamic, his absence from the current planning session suggesting either genuine discomfort with the proposed activities or tactical awareness that made him reluctant to be directly associated with whatever was being organized. Sarah finished her work on the weather radar system and moved to the flight control simulation platform, where hydraulic systems replicated the stick and rudder responses that trainee pilots needed to master before transitioning to real aircraft. The work required her to lie partially underneath the mechanism, reaching into spaces that were designed for access rather than comfort, her position vulnerable in ways that made her hyper-aware of who was moving through the building around her. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was spending her day maintaining systems designed to teach people skills she had mastered years earlier in aircraft that these students would never be qualified to approach. The flight control responses she was calibrating were programmed to replicate the handling characteristics of civilian aircraft that flew predictable routes at reasonable altitudes, while her actual experience involved machines that operated at the edges of flight envelopes and conditions that would overwhelm most commercial pilots. But her current life required her to appear appropriately impressed by the Academy's training technology, to treat routine maintenance as if it were challenging technical work, and to interact with pilot trainees as if they were pursuing careers that she found interesting rather than elementary. The performance was exhausting in ways that actual technical work never had been, requiring constant attention to maintaining a persona that was competent enough to justify her employment, but not so capable as to raise questions about her background. Sarah was testing the response calibration on the rudder pedals when Linda Foster appeared in the simulator building, her presence immediately recognizable by the sound of confident footsteps and the subtle change in air pressure that seemed to accompany people who had spent decades making decisions under stress. "How are the systems running today, Miss Chen?" Linda's question was routine, but her tone carried undertones that suggested she was monitoring more than just equipment status. "All systems within normal parameters," Sarah replied, her voice maintaining the neutral professionalism that had become second nature after years of practice. The weather radar simulation needed minor calibration adjustment, but everything else is running according to specifications. Linda nodded, but her attention seemed to be focused on details beyond technical reports. "I noticed some of the pilot trainees have been showing unusual interest in the simulator building lately. More than typical curiosity about equipment they're not scheduled to use." Sarah straightened from her position under the flight control platform, recognizing that Linda's observation was actually a warning disguised as casual conversation. "I haven't noticed anything disruptive to normal operations." "Good," Linda replied, but her expression suggested that she was prepared for that situation to change. "Please let me know immediately if anyone requests access to systems outside their training parameters or asks questions that seem inappropriate for their level of certification." After Linda left, Sarah continued her maintenance routine, but with the understanding that Academy management was actively monitoring the situation rather than just hoping it would resolve itself through official warnings and policy reminders. The intervention was appreciated, But Sarah's experience in environments where official protection was often unavailable had taught her not to depend entirely on institutional safeguards. Sarah had learned to function in gray areas where guidelines and protection depended more on personal capability than organizational policy. Her current civilian life existed within legal frameworks and employment protections that her previous career had largely operated outside. But the fundamental dynamics of threat assessment and personal security remained constant regardless of the context. As the afternoon progressed and the Academy's training schedule moved into high-activity periods, Sarah noticed the subtle signs that suggested Jake Morrison's group was proceeding with whatever they had planned, despite the previous evening's official warning. Tyler appeared near the simulator building twice during periods when he had no legitimate business in the area. Alex made unnecessary trips past the maintenance storage room, his nervous energy evident in the way he avoided making direct eye contact while clearly monitoring her activities. The pattern was familiar from other contexts where people had attempted surveillance without adequate training, their presence more obvious than they realized and their intentions more transparent than they intended. Sarah continued her work, with apparent focus on technical tasks, while actually tracking movement patterns and assessing the likelihood that casual workplace harassment was evolving into something more organized and potentially more dangerous. Because Sarah Chen had learned in places where mistakes were often fatal that the best time to address problems was before they fully developed, when options were still available and escalation could still be prevented through appropriate demonstration of capability and willingness to use it if necessary. Part 5. Antagonist establishment. Jake Morrison had built his entire identity around being the kind of person that others noticed, envied, and wanted to impress. At 28, he possessed the effortless confidence that came from a lifetime of advantages smoothly converting into achievements, doors opening before he needed to knock, and problems resolving themselves through the intervention of people who found it easier to help him than to deal with the consequences of disappointing him. His father owned a successful charter flight company that specialized in executive transportation and luxury recreational flying, the kind of operation that maintained a fleet of pristine aircraft and employed pilots who understood that their primary job was making wealthy clients feel important rather than just getting them safely from one location to another. Jake had grown up around aviation, but his familiarity with the industry came from the owner's perspective rather than the worker's experience, shaped by conversations about profit margins and client relationships rather than maintenance schedules and safety protocols. The transition from recreational flying with professional pilots to serious flight training had been more challenging than Jake had expected, though he would never admit that difficulty to anyone who might interpret his struggles as weakness or incompetence. The technical requirements were manageable, but the discipline and precision demanded by professional aviation standards conflicted with his natural tendency to rely on charm and connections rather than systematic preparation and methodical skill development. Jake's flight instructor, a former military pilot with 30 years of experience in both combat and civilian aviation, had noted in his evaluation reports that Jake possessed natural flying ability and quick reflexes, but also demonstrated concerning tendencies toward overconfidence and insufficient respect for safety protocols. The instructor's recommendations included additional training on decision-making under pressure and mandatory review of authority structures in professional aviation environments. Those recommendations had been carefully worded to avoid direct criticism while documenting concerns that could become serious problems if Jake advanced to positions where his attitudes could endanger other people. But Jake had interpreted the feedback as personality conflicts with instructors who didn't appreciate his aggressive flying style and innovative approaches to standard procedures. The previous evening's meeting with Linda Foster had been particularly frustrating because it represented the kind of administrative interference that Jake associated with institutional jealousy of individual excellence. His interpretation of events was that Academy management was overreacting to harmless workplace interactions, creating problems where none had existed, and imposing restrictions that would prevent legitimate professional development activities. Jake's version of the situation cast him as a dedicated student pilot, seeking to expand his technical knowledge through informal discussions with Academy personnel, who should be eager to share their expertise with future aviation professionals. The fact that his intended approach involved deliberately creating uncomfortable situations for someone who had given no indication of wanting to participate in educational activities was simply a detail that didn't factor into his self-justifying narrative. Tyler Brooks had attached himself to Jake's social orbit during the first week of flight training, recognizing in Jake the kind of natural leader who could provide both entertainment and protection from the social uncertainties that made institutional environments challenging for people without strong personalities. Tyler's background was less privileged than Jake's. His path to aviation training funded through student loans and part-time work rather than family wealth. But his survival instincts had taught him to identify and align with people who possessed the resources and confidence to navigate complex social situations. Tyler's role in the group dynamic was to amplify Jake's ideas and provide enthusiastic support for plans that he might privately consider questionable, but which offered opportunities to maintain his position within the social structure that Jake dominated. He was intelligent enough to understand the potential consequences of their planned activities, but emotionally dependent enough on group acceptance to prioritize loyalty over judgment when those considerations conflicted. The morning after Linda Foster's warning, Tyler found Jake in the pilot's lounge reviewing flight charts with the kind of intense focus that suggested he was working through problems that extended beyond navigation planning. Jake's body language radiated frustration in ways that Tyler had learned to interpret as opportunities to demonstrate support and solidarity. "That meeting last night was completely out of line," Tyler said, settling into the adjacent chair with the casual familiarity of someone confident in his welcome. "Administration treating us like we're some kind of harassment problem when all we wanted was to learn more about the equipment we're training on." Jake looked up from his charts, his expression shifting from frustration to gratitude for Tyler's validation of his perspective. "Exactly. Since when is it inappropriate for pilot trainees to ask technical questions?" Foster acted like we were planning some kind of assault instead of seeking professional development opportunities. Tyler nodded vigorously, his agreement, providing the kind of emotional reinforcement that Jake needed to maintain his self-justifying interpretation of events. Plus, if that technician can't handle basic questions about the systems she maintains, maybe she's not qualified for her position. Professional aviation doesn't have room for people who can't explain their work to the pilots who depend on their competence. The conversation was building momentum in directions that both participants understood were leading toward renewed commitment to their original plan. Despite the official warning they had received, Jake's frustration with administrative interference was combining with Tyler's need to prove his loyalty, creating a dynamic that was likely to result in escalated rather than abandoned activities. Alex Rivera had been listening to this conversation from a nearby table, his discomfort evident in the way he fidgeted with his training materials and avoided making eye contact with either Jake or Tyler. Alex Rivera had been listening to this conversation from a nearby table, his discomfort evident in the way he fidgeted with his training materials and avoided making eye contact with either Jake or Tyler. Alex possessed the kind of analytical mind that made him excellent at flight planning and navigation calculations, but his natural tendency toward careful consideration of consequences made him poorly suited for the kind of impulsive group activities that Jake seemed to specialize in organizing. His family had sacrificed considerably to fund his aviation training, pooling resources from multiple relatives and taking on debt that would follow Alex for years, regardless of whether his career plans succeeded or failed. The financial pressure created a constant awareness that mistakes could be catastrophically expensive, not just for him but for everyone who had invested in his future. This perspective made him naturally cautious about activities that could jeopardize his standing at the academy or create problems that might affect his ability to complete his training. But Alex also understood that social isolation could be equally dangerous in institutional environments where group dynamics influenced everything from study group participation to instructor recommendations. Jake Morrison possessed the kind of natural charisma and family connections that could either help or hinder other students' progress, depending on whether they were considered allies or obstacles to his ambitions. The previous evening's meeting with Linda Foster had clarified for Alex that their casual conversation about testing Sarah Chun's technical knowledge had been interpreted by Academy management as potential harassment, a realization that filled him with anxiety about how his participation might be documented in his student file. Aviation careers depended heavily on maintaining clean records and positive recommendations, and any suggestion of unprofessional conduct could follow him through decades of employment applications and security clearance reviews. "I'm not sure we should proceed with that discussion idea," Alex said quietly, his voice carefully modulated to express concern without directly challenging Jake's authority within the group. "After last night's meeting, it seems like management is paying a lot of attention to how we interact with Academy staff." Jake's expression hardened slightly, the kind of micro-expression that indicated he interpreted disagreement as disloyalty rather than reasonable caution. "That's exactly the problem, Alex. We're letting administrative paranoia prevent legitimate educational activities. If we back down every time someone in management gets nervous about normal workplace interactions, we'll never learn anything beyond what's in the official curriculum." Tyler nodded enthusiastically, his agreement serving both to support Jake's position and to demonstrate his own reliability as an ally. "Jake's right. We can't let bureaucratic overreaction stop us from pursuing professional development. If we're going to be commercial pilots, we need to understand these systems better than the minimum requirements." Alex felt the familiar tension that came from being caught between his personal judgment and group pressure, a situation that had been complicated by his genuine respect for Jake's flying ability and leadership qualities. Jake was unquestionably one of the most naturally gifted pilots in their training class, with reflexes and spatial awareness that instructors noticed and commented on favorably. His confidence in the cockpit was inspiring, and his willingness to push boundaries had led to several breakthrough moments in Alex's own skill development. But Jake's social interactions outside the cockpit demonstrated a different kind of boundary pushing that made Alex increasingly uncomfortable. There was a pattern of behavior that involved identifying people who appeared vulnerable or isolated, then creating situations where their limitations could be exposed for the entertainment of others. Alex had witnessed several incidents where Jake's educational curiosity had resulted in embarrassment or humiliation for Academy personnel who had the misfortune to be selected as teaching opportunities. "Maybe we could find a different approach to learning about the simulator systems," Alex suggested, trying to find middle ground that would satisfy Jake's determination while avoiding the kind of confrontational scenario that had attracted management attention. "The manufacturer probably has technical representatives who could arrange formal presentations, or we could request additional training sessions through official channels." Jake's laugh carried a dismissive edge that indicated he found Alex's suggestion both naive and disappointing. "Alex, you're thinking like a student instead of a future professional. Real aviation careers are built on networking and informal relationships, not just formal training programs. The ability to connect with technical personnel and maintenance crews is going to be crucial when we're working for airlines or charter companies." Tyler seized the opportunity to reinforce Jake's argument while simultaneously demonstrating his superior understanding of professional dynamics. "That's absolutely true. Pilots who can't communicate effectively with ground crews and technical staff end up with problems that could have been prevented through better relationships. This is exactly the kind of professional development that separates successful pilots from those who struggle with career advancement. The rationalization was sophisticated, enough to sound reasonable while completely avoiding the actual nature of what Jake had originally proposed. Alex recognized the rhetorical technique from political debates and sales presentations, where objectionable activities were reframed as virtuous necessities that only short-sighted people would oppose. Danny Walsh appeared in the doorway of the pilot's lounge, his timing suggesting he had been listening to the conversation from the corridor rather than arriving coincidentally. Danny's background was different from the others in ways that created both connection and distance within the group dynamic. His father was a career military NCO who had spent 30 years maintaining aircraft in environments where mistakes could be measured in casualties rather than just equipment damage. Growing up in that environment had given Danny a perspective on aviation that emphasized safety, respect for technical expertise, and understanding that the people who maintained aircraft often possessed knowledge that could be the difference between successful missions and catastrophic failures. His natural inclination was to treat maintenance personnel as valuable resources rather than convenient targets for entertainment. But Danny also understood that flight training was as much about social dynamics as technical competence, and that isolation from influential groups could create problems that extended far beyond immediate social discomfort. Jake Morrison's family connections and natural leadership abilities made him someone whose friendship could be valuable and whose opposition could be problematic. "What are you guys discussing?" Danny asked, his tone carefully neutral in ways that suggested he was testing the group's intentions rather than seeking information he didn't already possess. Jake looked up with the kind of welcoming expression he reserved for potential converts to whatever cause he was currently promoting. "We're talking about the importance of developing professional relationships with technical personnel, building the kind of networking skills that will be crucial for our aviation careers." Danny nodded slowly, his expression suggesting he was processing the explanation and finding it incomplete or unsatisfying. "That makes sense in principle. Professional relationships are definitely important in aviation. Are you planning specific networking activities?" The question was delivered with the kind of casual directness that made evasive answers obvious, forcing Jake to either provide concrete details or acknowledge that his networking concept was actually something different than standard professional development. Tyler jumped in with what he apparently thought was helpful clarification. "We were thinking about arranging an informal discussion with Sarah Chen, the simulator technician. Educational opportunity, you know. Chance to learn more about the systems. We're training on from someone who works with them every day." Danny's expression didn't change, but something subtle shifted in his posture that suggested Tyler's explanation had actually made the situation clearer rather than more acceptable. An informal discussion about technical systems with someone who didn't request or arrange such a discussion. The observation was delivered without accusation or judgment, but it highlighted the fundamental problem with their planned approach in ways that made continued rationalization difficult. Danny's military background had taught him to recognize the difference between legitimate professional development and activities that used professional justification to mask inappropriate intentions. Jake's frustration with the conversations direction was becoming evident in his body language, the kind of tension that suggested he was losing patience with explanations and obstacles. "Danny, sometimes in professional environments you have to take initiative rather than waiting for formal invitations. If we only interact with people through official channels, we'll never develop the relationships that make careers successful." "I understand that perspective," Danny replied, his tone remaining neutral despite Jake's increasingly defensive posture. "My concern is that the person we're planning to develop relationships with might not share our enthusiasm for informal educational discussions, especially after last night's meeting with management. Alex felt relief that someone else was expressing concerns similar to his own, creating space for dissent within the group dynamic that had been increasingly dominated by Jake and Tyler's mutual reinforcement. That's exactly what I was thinking. The timing seems problematic, given that administration is already monitoring our interactions with Academy staff. Jake's expression hardened into the kind of stubborn determination that indicated he was interpreting opposition as a challenge to his leadership rather than reasonable concerns about practical consequences. That's precisely why we need to proceed carefully but decisively. If we let administrative paranoia dictate our professional development activities, we're essentially accepting that we can't function as independent aviation professionals. Tyler nodded vigorously, his agreement serving to reinforce Jake's position while demonstrating his continued loyalty to whatever course of action Jake decided to pursue. Jake's absolutely right. We can't let bureaucratic interference prevent us from learning what we need to know to be successful pilots. The conversation was reaching a decision point where continued discussion would either result in consensus or create divisions within the group that could affect their relationships for the remainder of their training program. Danny and Alex were expressing reasonable concerns about potential consequences, while Jake and Tyler were committed to proceeding with activities that had already attracted unfavorable attention from Academy management. What specifically are you proposing? Danny asked, his question designed to force Jake to articulate concrete plans rather than continuing to speak in generalities about professional development and networking opportunities. Jake looked around the group, assessing the level of commitment and resistance he was facing before committing to details that would make retreat more difficult. Simple approach. We arrange a casual meeting to discuss some technical questions about simulator systems. Nothing confrontational, nothing inappropriate. Just professional curiosity about equipment we're expected to understand for our training. Where would this meeting take place? Danny's follow-up question continued, his pattern of seeking specifics that would reveal the true nature of what was being planned. Somewhere informal, Jake replied, his vagueness suggesting he hadn't thought through practical details or was reluctant to reveal aspects of his plan that might increase opposition. Maybe the pilot's lounge after regular hours when we can have an uninterrupted discussion. Alex felt his anxiety increasing as Jake's plan became more concrete. An after-hours meeting in the pilot's lounge with someone who hasn't agreed to attend such a meeting to discuss technical systems that she maintains professionally and we're learning about academically. Exactly, Tyler agreed enthusiastically, apparently missing the skeptical undertone in Alex's summary. Perfect opportunity for real professional development without the artificial constraints of formal training sessions. Danny was quiet for a long moment, his expression suggesting he was working through implications that the others hadn't considered or were choosing to ignore. Jake, can I ask you something directly? What do you expect to learn from this informal discussion that you couldn't learn through official channels or technical documentation? The question cut through the professional development justifications and forced Jake to confront the actual motivations behind his plan. The silence that followed was filled with tension as Jake realized that honest answers would reveal intentions that couldn't be defended as legitimate educational activities. I think, Jake said finally, his tone carrying a note of frustration with the interrogation he was receiving from people he had expected to support his leadership, that we're overthinking a simple professional interaction. Sarah Chen maintains complex technical systems that we need to understand. We're aviation students seeking to expand our knowledge. What could be more appropriate than an informal discussion between professionals? Danny nodded slowly, but his expression suggested he found Jake's explanation unsatisfying rather than convincing. And if she declines to participate in this informal discussion, or if she feels uncomfortable with questions that go beyond her normal job responsibilities, Then we'll respect her decision and find other ways to learn what we need to know. Jake replied, his answer sounding reasonable while completely avoiding the implications of Danny's question about what would happen if Sarah didn't. Chen felt pressured or trapped by their approach. Tyler's enthusiasm was undaunted by the concerns being raised by Danny and Alex. Besides, she's probably eager to share her expertise with people who appreciate her technical knowledge. Most maintenance personnel enjoy explaining their work to pilots who show genuine interest. Alex wondered if Tyler had ever actually met maintenance personnel who enjoyed explaining their work to pilots, or if he was simply assuming that technical workers were naturally eager to provide free education to flight students who demanded their attention. His own limited interactions with Academy staff suggested that most technical personnel were busy with their own responsibilities and had little patience for students who interrupted their work with questions that could be answered through proper channels. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Captain Martinez, whose presence in the pilot's lounge immediately changed the atmosphere in ways that suggested his reputation among the students was built on both respect and healthy fear. Martinez had spent 25 years flying military aircraft in situations that had tested both his technical competence and his ability to make life-and-death decisions under extreme pressure, and his transition to civilian flight instruction had brought those standards to an environment where most students had never faced consequences more serious than failed check rides or delayed graduation. "Gentlemen," Martinez said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made casual conversation pause automatically, "I hope you're using your break time productively. Ground school examinations are next week, and I've noticed that some students seem to be spending more time on extracurricular activities than academic preparation." The observation was delivered without direct accusation, but everyone in the group understood that Martinez was aware of their recent interactions with Academy management and was monitoring their activities with the kind of attention that could significantly impact their training evaluations. Jake straightened slightly, his posture automatically adjusting to show appropriate respect for Martinez's authority while maintaining the confidence that had served him well throughout his academic and professional development. "Yes, sir, Captain. We were just discussing ways to expand our technical knowledge beyond the standard curriculum requirements." Martinez nodded, but his expression suggested he was evaluating Jake's explanation rather than simply accepting it at face value. Technical knowledge is certainly important for aviation professionals. I trust you're pursuing that knowledge through appropriate channels and maintaining the professional standards expected of Academy students. The statement was simultaneously supportive and warning, acknowledging the value of expanded learning, while reminding them that their methods and conduct were subject to evaluation by people whose opinions could affect their future careers. "Absolutely, sir," Tyler replied quickly, his eagerness to demonstrate proper attitude apparent in both his tone and his posture. "We understand the importance of maintaining professional standards in all our interactions with Academy personnel." Martinez's attention shifted to Danny and Alex, both of whom had remained quiet during the exchange. "Mr. Walsh, Mr. Rivera, do you have anything to add regarding your approach to professional development and technical education?" Danny met Martinez's gaze directly, his military background providing him with the confidence to communicate honestly with authority figures. "Sir, I believe that technical knowledge should be pursued through channels that respect both the expertise of Academy personnel and the professional standards that govern our training environment." Alex nodded in agreement, relieved to have Danny's example to follow. "Yes, sir, I agree completely. Professional development should enhance our training without creating problems for the people who support our educational objectives." Martinez studied the group for another moment, his experienced eyes taking in details of body language and interpersonal dynamics that most people would miss. "Excellent. I'm confident that all Academy students will continue to demonstrate the maturity and judgment that prepare them for successful aviation careers. After Martinez left, the pilot's lounge felt different, as if his presence had altered the fundamental dynamics governing the group's discussion. Jake's confidence appeared slightly diminished. Tyler's enthusiasm seemed more forced, and both Danny and Alex looked relieved to have had their concerns implicitly validated by someone whose authority was unquestionable. "Well," Jake said finally, his tone suggesting he was working to recapture the momentum that Martinez's intervention had disrupted, "I think we all understand the importance of maintaining appropriate professional standards while pursuing legitimate educational opportunities." Tyler nodded agreement, but his earlier enthusiasm had been replaced by something that looked more like uncertainty about how to proceed without risking further attention from Academy authority figures. Danny and Alex exchanged glances that suggested they were both hoping the conversation would end without any firm commitments to activities that they had serious reservations about pursuing. But Jake Morrison was not someone who abandoned plans easily, especially when those plans had evolved from casual ideas into personal challenges that involved his reputation for leadership and his ability to organize group activities despite administrative obstacles and peer resistance. The afternoon would bring new opportunities to refine his approach and rebuild group consensus around objectives that could be achieved without triggering additional intervention from Academy management or authority figures whose opinions could affect everyone's future prospects in aviation. Because Jake had learned throughout his life that persistence and creativity could overcome most obstacles, and that the key to successful leadership was finding ways to achieve desired outcomes, regardless of the challenges presented by rules, restrictions, or other people's concerns about appropriateness and consequences. The afternoon sun blazed through the windows of the pilot's lounge as Jake Morrison sat alone, his flight manual open, but his attention focused on the problem that had consumed his thoughts since Captain Martinez's intervention earlier that day. The official warnings and peer resistance had transformed what began as casual workplace entertainment into something that felt personal, a test of his ability to navigate institutional obstacles and achieve objectives despite administrative interference and social pressure from people he had expected to support his leadership. Jake's entire life had been structured around achieving goals through persistence and strategic thinking, qualities that had served him well in academic environments and social situations where his natural advantages could be leveraged into successful outcomes. His father's business success had been built on similar principles, identifying opportunities that others missed, developing approaches that circumvented conventional limitations, and maintaining focus on desired results regardless of temporary setbacks or opposition from people who lacked vision or courage. The current situation represented exactly the kind of challenge that Jake's upbringing had prepared him to handle. Chen was a problem that required a solution, and the fact that other people found his proposed approach questionable simply meant that he needed to refine his methods rather than abandon his objectives. Professional pilots were expected to make decisions under pressure, to find ways to achieve mission success despite weather conditions, mechanical problems, and air traffic control restrictions that created obstacles for less capable aviators. Jake pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found Tyler's number, then sent a text message that was carefully worded to avoid language that could be problematic if intercepted by Academy management or misinterpreted by people who didn't understand the full context of their professional development objectives. Need to discuss training schedule modifications. Meet me in Hangar 7 maintenance area at 1900 hours. Important opportunity that requires discreet handling. The response came back within minutes, Tyler's enthusiasm evident even in his brief reply. Absolutely, we'll be there. Ready to support whatever approach you think is best. Jake smiled at Tyler's predictable reliability, then considered whether to include Danny and Alex in the revised planning session. Both had expressed concerns during the morning's discussion, that suggested they might not be prepared for the kind of decisive action that the situation required. But their participation could still be valuable if they could be convinced to overcome their hesitancy about challenging administrative restrictions. After several minutes of consideration, Jake decided to proceed with Tyler alone for the initial planning phase, then determine whether Danny and Alex should be included based on how the revised approach developed. Sometimes leadership required making difficult decisions about group composition, excluding people whose commitment was questionable in favor of maintaining operational security and ensuring that plans could be executed without internal opposition or compromise. Jake spent the remainder of the afternoon conducting research that had nothing to do with flight training, but everything to do with understanding the tactical situation he was facing. He reviewed Sarah Chen's work schedule through casual observation of academy maintenance routines, noting when she typically arrived, which areas of the facility she worked in during different parts of the day, and when she usually departed for home. The information was gathered through legitimate activities like visiting the simulator building for scheduled training sessions and walking through hangars for authorized aircraft inspections, but Jake's attention was focused on intelligence collection rather than educational objectives. He also made discreet inquiries about academy security protocols, asking questions about after-hours access procedures and facility monitoring systems under the pretense of understanding student responsibilities for equipment security and emergency response procedures. The information he gathered suggested that certain areas of the academy were less closely supervised during evening hours, particularly maintenance spaces that were typically accessed only by technical personnel who worked predictable schedules. By the time Jake made his way to Hangar 7 for the meeting with Tyler, he had developed what he considered a much more sophisticated approach to their original objective. The revised plan addressed the concerns that had been raised by academy management while maintaining focus on the core goal of demonstrating Sarah Chen's technical limitations to an audience that would appreciate the educational value of exposing incompetence in positions of responsibility. Tyler arrived precisely at 1900 hours. His punctuality and eager expression confirming Jake's assessment that he remained committed to supporting whatever activities Jake organized, regardless of the complexity or potential risks involved. "Thanks for meeting me," Jake said, his tone conveying the kind of serious purpose that indicated important decisions were being made. "I've been thinking about the concerns that were raised this morning, and I believe I've developed an approach that addresses those issues while still achieving our professional development objectives." Tyler leaned forward attentively, his body language demonstrating readiness to receive instructions and implement whatever plan Jake had formulated. "That's excellent, Jake. I knew you'd find a way to work through the obstacles. What's the new approach?" Jake glanced around the hangar to ensure their conversation wouldn't be overheard, then outlined his revised strategy with the kind of detail that indicated extensive planning and consideration of multiple contingencies. "The problem with our original approach was that it appeared confrontational to people who didn't understand our educational objectives," Jake began, his analysis casting previous opposition as misunderstanding rather than legitimate concern. Academy management interpreted our interest in technical discussions as potential harassment because they couldn't see the professional development value of what we were trying to accomplish. Tyler nodded agreement, his expression indicating he found Jake's interpretation both reasonable and insightful. "That makes perfect sense. Sometimes institutional bureaucracy prevents people from recognizing legitimate educational opportunities." "Exactly," Jake continued, his confidence building as Tyler's support reinforced his conviction that the revised plan was both necessary and appropriate. "So instead of a direct approach that might be misinterpreted, we need to create a situation where Sarah Chen's technical limitations become obvious through natural professional interactions rather than forced questioning." Tyler's expression shifted to curiosity mixed with anticipation. the look of someone eager to understand how Jake's strategic thinking would solve the problems they had encountered with their previous approach. Jake pulled out a tablet and opened a schematic diagram of the simulator building's technical systems, information that was readily available through the Academy's student resource portal, but which he had studied with intensity that went far beyond normal academic requirements. "Here's what I've learned about the evening maintenance schedule," Jake said, pointing to specific areas of the building layout. "Sarah Chen typically works alone after regular hours on system calibrations and diagnostic routines that require minimal supervision. The work takes her into areas of the building where she's isolated from other personnel and focused on technical tasks that demand her full attention." Tyler studied the schematic carefully, his engineering background helping him understand the technical layout even as he tried to anticipate how Jake planned to use this information for their objectives. "The beauty of this approach," Jake continued, "is that we create a legitimate technical emergency that requires immediate expert attention. Nothing dangerous or destructive, just a system malfunction that exposes her inability to handle complex problems under pressure." Tyler's enthusiasm was tempered by concern about the implications of what Jake was proposing. "When you say create a technical emergency, are you talking about actually causing equipment malfunctions?" Jake's expression remained confident, but his tone shifted slightly to address Tyler's concern. "Minor adjustments to system settings that create diagnostic puzzles requiring advanced technical knowledge to resolve. The kind of problems that a truly qualified technician should be able to handle efficiently, but which might overwhelm someone whose expertise is more limited than their job title suggests." The explanation was delivered with the kind of casual confidence that made complex plans sound simple and reasonable. But Tyler's engineering training had taught him enough about technical systems to understand that any unauthorized modifications could have consequences that were difficult to predict or control. "What if the modifications cause more serious problems than we intended?" Tyler asked, his question reflecting genuine concern about potential outcomes rather than reluctance to support Jake's leadership. Jake's response demonstrated the kind of preparation that had gone into his revised planning. "I've studied these systems extensively, Tyler. The modifications I'm proposing are reversible and limited in scope. Think of them as creating advanced diagnostic scenarios rather than actual damage, like turning a routine maintenance task into a complex troubleshooting exercise." Tyler processed this explanation while studying the schematic diagrams, his analytical mind working through the technical implications of what Jake was describing. The approach was certainly more sophisticated than their original plan of simply asking Sarah Chen questions designed to expose her limitations, but it also involved risks that their previous strategy had avoided. "How do we ensure that we're present to observe her response to these diagnostic challenges?" Tyler asked, his question indicating acceptance of Jake's approach while seeking clarity about implementation details. Jake's smile suggested he had anticipated this question and had developed what he considered an elegant solution. "We create a legitimate reason to be in the area during her evening maintenance routine, equipment inspection for our advanced systems, training, or research for a technical report that requires after-hours access to systems that are unavailable during regular training hours." The justification was plausible enough to satisfy administrative requirements while providing cover for their actual objectives, demonstrating the kind of strategic thinking that Jake prided himself on applying to complex problems. Tyler's concerns were gradually being addressed by Jake's detailed planning and confident explanations, but he felt obligated to raise one additional consideration that his engineering background suggested could be important. What if she actually solves the diagnostic problems we create? What if her technical knowledge is more extensive than we've assumed? Jake's laugh carried a note of dismissive confidence that indicated he considered this possibility remote at best. "Tyler, we've both observed her work routines and listened to her interactions with other technical personnel. She follows standard procedures and relies on reference manuals for anything beyond basic maintenance tasks. The diagnostic scenarios I'm planning will require the kind of advanced problem solving that goes far beyond routine equipment maintenance. Tyler found Jake's confidence reassuring, though his engineering training had taught him that complex systems often behaved unpredictably when modified by people who weren't intimately familiar with all their operational parameters and safety interlocks. "When are you planning to implement this approach?" Tyler asked, his question indicating commitment to participation while seeking information about timing and preparation requirements. Jake consulted his phone to check Sarah Chen's typical work schedule against the Academy's evening activity patterns. Tomorrow night would be optimal. She's scheduled for simulator calibration work that will keep her in the building until approximately 2,100 hours, and there's minimal instructor supervision during evening maintenance periods. Tyler nodded, though his expression suggested he was still processing the implications of what they were planning to do. "Do you want to include Danny and Alex in this revised approach?" Jake considered the question carefully, weighing the benefits of additional participants against the risks of including people whose commitment to the objectives remained questionable. "I think we should proceed with just the two of us initially," Jake decided. "If the approach proves successful, we can share the results with Danny and Alex, but for the implementation phase, we need people who are completely committed to achieving our professional development objectives." Tyler accepted this decision, understanding that Jake's assessment of group dynamics was probably accurate and that operational security was often better maintained with smaller teams that included only the most reliable participants. The remainder of their planning session focused on technical details and contingency planning, with Jake demonstrating the kind of thorough preparation that had made him successful in academic environments and flight training exercises. By the time they concluded their meeting, Tyler felt confident that Jake had developed an approach that would achieve their educational objectives while avoiding the administrative problems that had complicated their previous efforts. As they prepared to leave Hangar 7, Jake's final instructions carried the weight of someone who had assumed full responsibility for mission success and expected complete support from his chosen participants. "Remember, Tyler, this is about professional development and demonstrating the importance of technical competence in aviation safety," Jake said, his tone serious and purposeful. "What we're doing tomorrow night will provide valuable lessons about the standards that should be expected from people in positions of technical responsibility." Tyler nodded agreement, his commitment to supporting Jake's leadership overriding any residual concerns about the methods they planned to employ or the potential consequences of their actions for someone whose only offense had been maintaining a low profile while competently performing her assigned responsibilities. Neither Jake nor Tyler considered the possibility that their target might possess capabilities that extended far beyond routine maintenance tasks, or that their carefully planned diagnostic challenges might reveal expertise that could fundamentally alter their understanding of who they were dealing with and what kind of situation they were creating for themselves. The following evening would bring lessons that none of them had anticipated, delivered by someone whose quiet competence concealed experience and training that civilian aviation environments rarely encountered, and whose response to provocation would demonstrate the difference between theoretical knowledge and practical capability in ways that would be remembered long after their flight training was completed. Part 7. Escalating tension. The following evening settled over Phoenix Valley Aviation Academy with the kind of deceptive calm that often preceded significant weather events in the desert. The temperature had dropped from the day's brutal highs to merely uncomfortable, and the setting sun painted the aircraft and buildings in shades of orange and gold that made the facility look almost serene despite the tension that had been building. Throughout the day, Sarah Chen arrived for her evening maintenance shift with the heightened awareness that experience had taught her. to maintain when multiple indicators suggested that problems were developing beyond the horizon of immediate visibility. Her morning had included 3 separate encounters with Academy personnel who had never previously shown interest in her work schedule. Casual questions about her evening responsibilities that felt more like intelligence gathering than friendly curiosity, and a kind of increased attention from Jake Morrison's social circle that suggested their previous days' planning session had resulted in decisions rather than abandonment of their problematic objectives. Sarah's preparation for the evening shift reflected adjustments that most people would interpret as normal variations in routine, but which actually represented tactical modifications based on threat assessment and operational security considerations. Her tool selection emphasized items that could serve dual purposes if circumstances required capabilities beyond equipment maintenance. Her clothing choices prioritized freedom of movement over appearance while maintaining the professional image expected of Academy technical personnel. Her work schedule was structured to maintain maximum situational awareness while completing required tasks efficiently enough to avoid overtime that might create isolated exposure to potential problems. The simulator building felt different as Sarah conducted her evening system checks, not because of any physical changes, but because her heightened awareness was detecting subtle alterations in the facility's normal atmosphere. Equipment that was typically secured according to standard protocols showed signs of recent access by personnel who weren't part of the regular maintenance rotation. System settings displayed minor variations from the configuration she had established during her previous shift, changes that were small enough to avoid detection by casual observation, but significant enough to suggest deliberate modification by someone with sufficient technical knowledge to access restricted parameters. Sarah's initial reaction was to assume that day shift personnel had conducted additional maintenance activities that hadn't been documented according to normal procedures, a common occurrence in facilities where multiple teams worked on complex equipment systems. But her systematic review of the modifications revealed patterns that were inconsistent with routine maintenance activities and more suggestive of deliberate sabotage designed to create diagnostic challenges that would test her technical capabilities under pressure. The realization that someone had deliberately altered system configurations to create problems for her to solve shifted Sarah's threat assessment from general caution to specific operational awareness. This wasn't random equipment failure or normal maintenance complications. This was a planned scenario designed to evaluate her performance in situations that exceeded routine troubleshooting requirements. Sarah's response to this discovery drew upon training and experience that her civilian cover identity couldn't acknowledge, but which had been developed in environments where equipment sabotage was a common tactic used by hostile forces to compromise mission effectiveness and identify operational capabilities of enemy personnel. Her approach to the modified systems combined apparent confusion and concern with systematic diagnostic procedures that would either solve the problems efficiently or reveal the extent of the sabotage while maintaining her cover as a competent, but not exceptionally skilled technician. The first system she examined was the weather radar simulation platform, where someone had modified the signal processing parameters to create intermittent failures that would be difficult to diagnose. Without advanced understanding of the underlying electronics and software interactions, Sarah spent several minutes reviewing system documentation and testing basic connections, maintaining the appearance of someone working through a complex problem using standard troubleshooting procedures. But her actual analysis was proceeding on multiple levels simultaneously, identifying not just the specific modifications that had been made, but also the sophistication level of whoever had made them and the probable objectives behind creating this particular type of diagnostic challenge. The modifications demonstrated familiarity with the system, architecture, and access to technical documentation that wasn't readily available to flight training students, suggesting either extensive research or assistance from someone with deeper technical knowledge. Sarah was working on the second modified system when she became aware of movement in the corridor outside the simulator building. Footsteps that were trying to be quiet, but lacked the training necessary to move silently in environments where detection could compromise operational security. The timing and location suggested that her evening maintenance activities were being observed by people who wanted to monitor her response to the diagnostic challenges they had created. The knowledge that she was being watched added another layer of complexity to Sarah's situation, requiring her to balance multiple objectives, maintaining her cover identity as a technically competent but not exceptional maintenance worker, solving the problems that had been created to test her capabilities, and gathering intelligence about who was conducting this surveillance and what they hoped to accomplish through these activities. Sarah continued her systematic approach to diagnosing the modified systems, but she began incorporating subtle variations in her procedures that would provide information about the observers, technical knowledge, and patience levels. She made occasional comments to herself about the unusual nature of the problems she was encountering, observations that were loud enough to be overheard by anyone listening from the corridor, but which didn't reveal her understanding that the modifications were deliberate rather than random failures. "Interesting," Sarah said, her voice carrying just enough volume to be heard outside the building while maintaining the tone of someone puzzling through unexpected technical complications. "These signal processing parameters shouldn't drift like this unless there's been some kind of systematic interference with the calibration settings." Through the building's windows, Sarah could see reflections that revealed the positions of her observers without requiring her to look directly toward their location. Jake Morrison and Tyler Brooks were positioned near the maintenance entrance, their body language indicating intense focus on her activities and anticipation of outcomes that extended beyond simple curiosity about maintenance procedures. Sarah's assessment of the situation was becoming clearer as she continued, working on the modified systems while monitoring her observers' reactions to her progress. This was definitely a planned scenario designed to test her technical abilities, probably organized by Jake Morrison as a more sophisticated version of his original plan to expose her perceived limitations through direct questioning. The approach demonstrated considerable escalation from casual workplace harassment to deliberate sabotage and surveillance, indicating that Jake's commitment to his objectives had intensified rather than diminished in response to administrative warnings and peer resistance. The third system Sarah examined had been modified in ways that were more subtle but potentially more dangerous, with alterations to safety interlocks that could affect the simulator's ability to properly replicate emergency scenarios during training exercises. The modifications wouldn't cause immediate problems, but they could create situations where student pilots received incorrect feedback during crisis simulations, potentially compromising their preparation for real emergency situations. This discovery shifted Sarah's assessment of Jake Morrison from someone whose activities were inappropriate, but relatively harmless, to someone whose actions could potentially endanger other people through compromise of safety systems. The modification of training equipment safety features crossed lines that extended beyond workplace harassment into territory that could affect flight safety and student preparation for emergency situations. Sarah's response to this realization required careful consideration of multiple factors, maintaining her cover identity while addressing safety concerns, gathering evidence of deliberate sabotage without revealing her capability to detect sophisticated modifications, and determining whether the situation required immediate intervention or could be resolved through less direct approaches that wouldn't compromise her civilian persona. She decided to proceed with her maintenance routine while documenting the modifications she had discovered and preparing to report safety concerns through appropriate channels. But her operational awareness remained calibrated to threat levels that might require more direct action if the situation continued to escalate beyond boundaries that she could accept while maintaining her low-profile existence. Sarah was working on restoring the safety interlock configurations when she heard voices from the corridor. Jake and Tyler discussing her progress with the kind of anticipation that suggested they expected her to struggle with problems that they believed exceeded her technical capabilities. "She's been working on those systems for over an hour." Tyler's voice carried clearly through the building's thin walls. If she really understood advanced diagnostics, she should have identified the problems by now. Jake's response demonstrated confidence in his approach and satisfaction with the apparent results. "That's exactly what I expected. She's following standard troubleshooting procedures that work fine for routine maintenance, but aren't sufficient for complex diagnostic scenarios. This is perfect demonstration of why technical positions require people with real expertise rather than just basic competence." Sarah continued her work while listening to their commentary, understanding that they interpreted her methodical approach as confusion rather than systematic problem-solving designed to address multiple objectives simultaneously. Their assessment of her capabilities was based on assumptions about her background and training that were fundamentally incorrect, leading to expectations about her performance that were likely to be disappointed in ways they hadn't anticipated. The fourth modified system presented challenges that required knowledge of advanced electronics and software interactions that extended well beyond typical aviation maintenance requirements. Sarah recognized the modifications as sophisticated, enough to suggest assistance from someone with engineering background or access to detailed technical documentation that wasn't readily available to flight training students. But the problems also fell well within the range of her actual capabilities, developed through years of maintaining much more complex systems under conditions that made the current situation seem like a controlled laboratory exercise. Sarah's apparent struggle with the diagnostic challenges was actually careful performance designed to maintain her cover while systematically identifying and correcting the sabotage that had been introduced to test her limitations. As Sarah worked through the final system modifications, she became aware that her observers were becoming restless with the length of time her diagnostic work was requiring. Their voices carried increasing anticipation, mixed with concern that their carefully planned scenario wasn't producing the rapid failure they had expected to witness. "Maybe the problems we created were too complex," Tyler's voice suggested growing uncertainty about their approach. "She's obviously working hard to solve them, but if they're beyond anyone's capability to diagnose quickly, we might not learn anything useful about her technical limitations." Jake's response indicated he was not ready to abandon his objectives. Despite the unexpected duration of Sarah's problem-solving efforts, "Give her more time, Tyler. Complex diagnostic work always takes longer than people expect, especially when someone is working beyond their normal competence level. The important thing is that we're getting a realistic assessment of her capabilities under pressure." Sarah completed her restoration of the final modified system and began conducting verification tests to ensure that all safety functions and operational parameters had been returned to proper configurations. Her work had been thorough and systematic, addressing not just the obvious modifications, but also subtle changes that might have been overlooked by someone with less extensive technical background. The completion of her maintenance tasks created a decision point for both Sarah and her observers. Jake and Tyler had expected to witness technical failure that would confirm their assumptions about her limitations, but instead they had observed competent problem-solving that suggested her capabilities were more extensive than they had anticipated. Sarah understood that her observers were likely to interpret her successful completion of the diagnostic challenges as either unexpected competence or assistance from resources they hadn't considered, and that their response to this outcome would determine whether the situation concluded with their current activities or escalated into additional attempts to test her capabilities through more aggressive methods. The evening was reaching a critical juncture where multiple courses of action were possible, depending on how Jake Morrison processed the results of his carefully planned scenario and whether his commitment to proving Sarah's incompetence would lead him to accept evidence that contradicted his assumptions or drive him to create more challenging situations that might reveal capabilities he wasn't prepared to discover. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.